The phone rang at 8:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because I was staring at the clock on the microwave, counting down the minutes until my favorite show started. The sound cut through our quiet living room like a blade through silk, sharp, unexpected, violent in its normalcy. My sister's voice came through the speaker, tight and strange. There was airplane noise in the background, that low mechanical hum that means departure gates and last-minute boarding calls. She'd never called me from the airport before. Hell, she barely called me at all unless someone was dead or dying. "I need to ask you something," she said, and her voice had that careful quality people use when they're about to destroy your world with surgical precision. "Your husband, is he home right now?" I looked across the room at him. My husband of 7 years, sitting in his favorite leather chair, the one that cost more than my car payment, with his feet up on the ottoman, scrolling through his phone with that absent, satisfied expression he always wore after dinner. The lamp beside him cast this warm, golden glow across his face, making him look almost angelic, almost innocent. "Yes," I said, watching him take a slow sip of his coffee. "He's sitting in the living room." The silence that followed stretched like a wire pulled too tight. I could hear my sister breathing, could hear the gate announcements echoing in whatever terminal she was standing in. When she spoke again, her voice dropped to a whisper that made my blood freeze. "That can't be true. I'm watching him board my flight to Paris with another woman." The world tilted. Actually tilted, like someone had grabbed the edges of reality and given it a violent shake. I felt my phone slip in my suddenly sweaty palm, felt my mouth go dry as desert sand. My husband looked up at me then, probably hearing the change in my breathing, and he smiled. That same easy, comfortable smile he'd been giving me for 7 years. The smile I used to think meant home. "What did you say?" The words came out cracked, broken. "Gate B17. I'm deadheading to Paris, working the flight." He's 3 rows in front of me in business class with a blonde woman in a red dress. They're holding hands. She's wearing what looks like a wedding ring. My name is Clara. I'm 32 years old. And that was the moment my world split in two. The man in my living room, still smiling at me with coffee-warmed lips, and the man on that plane, touching another woman's fingers like they held secrets he'd never shared with me. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the hardwood floor. The sound was sharp, final, like a gavel in a courtroom where I was being sentenced for crimes I didn't know I'd committed. My husband, the one sitting 3 feet away from me, the one who couldn't possibly be boarding a plane to Paris, raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Sweetheart. The word hit me like a slap. How many times had he called other women sweetheart? How many times had he used that same gentle, concerned tone with someone else while I sat at home, trusting, believing, waiting? I bent down and picked up my phone. My sister was still there, still whispering. "Clara? Clara, are you there?" "I'm here," I managed. The woman. She looks like she could be her age. Maybe younger. She's laughing at something he's saying. They look comfortable together. Like they've done this before. Like they've done this before. The words echoed in my skull, bouncing around like pinballs, hitting every memory, every business trip, every late night at the office, every weekend conference that required him to leave on Friday and not return until Monday morning. How many times had I kissed him goodbye at the front door, wished him safe travels, told him to call me when he landed? How many times had he called someone else instead? "I have to go," I whispered into the phone. "The plane's boarding." Wait, but she was already gone. The line went dead, leaving me standing in my living room, holding a silent phone, staring at a man who was supposed to be my husband, but was apparently also somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean with a woman in a red dress. He was still looking at me, still wearing that expression of mild concern that I now realized was probably his default face for dealing with my emotions. Patient. Indulgent. Like I was a child having a tantrum about something that didn't really matter. "Who was that?" he asked, setting down his coffee cup with the kind of careful precision that suggested he was paying more attention than he wanted me to know. Wrong number, I said, and the lie tasted like copper in my mouth. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his phone. Just like that. No follow-up questions, no curiosity about why a wrong number had left me looking like I'd seen a ghost. Because why would he be suspicious? He had no reason to think I knew anything. In his mind, he was sitting safely in his chair while his double lived a completely separate life 30,000 feet above the ocean. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching him scroll through whatever app was holding his attention, Instagram, maybe, or Facebook, or some dating site where he was arranging his next business trip with his next woman in her next red dress. The lamplight caught the gold of his wedding ring, the ring I'd slipped onto his finger 7 years ago while promising to love and honor and cherish him until death did us part. Apparently, I'd been planning to honor a ghost. The room felt different now. The walls seemed closer, the air thicker. The furniture that had been ours was suddenly just mine, and his, separately, no longer belonging to the mythical unit we'd pretended to be. I could smell his coffee, that dark roast he preferred, mixed with his cologne, the expensive stuff I'd bought him for Christmas. And underneath it all, something else. Something that might have been guilt, or lies, or just the scent of a life I'd never really known. I needed to leave. Not tomorrow, not after we talked about it, not after I confronted him and gave him a chance to explain with more creative fiction. I needed to leave right now, before I did something I couldn't take back. Before I started screaming and never stopped. I'm going out, I said, grabbing my purse from the counter. Now. He looked up, and for just a second, I saw something flicker across his face. Relief, maybe? Or calculation. It's kind of late, isn't it? I need some air. Want me to come with you? The question was so absurd, so perfectly normal, that I almost laughed. Want him to come with me while I processed the fact that he was simultaneously sitting in our living room and flying to Paris with another woman? Want him to hold my hand while I figured out how to breathe around the knowledge that my entire life was a lie? No, I said. I'll be back. But I already knew I wouldn't be. The night air hit my face like a cold slap, sharp and cleansing. I got in my car, not our car, because apparently we'd never actually shared anything, and drove without direction, letting muscle memory and autopilot take me away from the house where my husband was probably already making plans to cover his tracks. I ended up at a motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and rooms that rented by the hour. The Stardust Motor Inn, according to the pink and blue sign that buzzed like an angry wasp. Stars and dust. How poetic. How fitting for the moment when everything I'd thought was solid turned out to be nothing but cosmic debris. The desk clerk was a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and yellow-stained fingers from too many cigarettes. She didn't ask questions when I paid cash for a room, didn't comment on the fact that I had no luggage, didn't seem to notice that my hands were shaking as I signed the register with a name that felt foreign on my tongue. Clara Morrison. Was I still Clara Morrison? Or had I stopped being that person the moment my sister's voice cut through the lie I'd been living? Room 23 was exactly what you'd expect from a place like the Stardust. Thin carpet that had seen too much, wallpaper peeling at the corners, a bed with sheets that smelled like industrial detergent and other people's secrets. The air conditioning unit under the window wheezed and rattled, fighting a losing battle against the heat that seemed to seep through the walls. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the phone in my hands. 15 missed calls from him already. 15 attempts to reach me, to explain, to lie some more. The voicemails would be masterpieces of manipulation, I was sure. Concern morphing into irritation, morphing into righteous anger that I dared to leave without explanation. But I didn't listen to them. Instead, I turned off the phone and set it on the nightstand like it was radioactive. The silence in the room was complete, broken only by the wheeze of the air conditioner and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. For the first time in 7 years, I was truly alone. Not waiting for him to come home alone, not he's working late again alone, but completely, utterly by myself. And in that silence, I could finally hear the sound of my own thoughts without his voice drowning them out. How long had this been going on? That was the question that kept circling back, like a vulture over roadkill. How many business trips? How many conferences? How many times had I packed his suitcase with my own hands, folding his shirts with care, making sure he had enough socks and underwear for his travels? How many times had I been an unknowing accomplice to my own betrayal? The woman in the red dress. I kept seeing her in my mind, this phantom figure holding my husband's hand at 30,000 feet. Did she know about me? Was I the other woman in their story, the inconvenient wife back home who didn't know she was supposed to disappear? Or was she just like me, another woman being lied to, another heart being set up for demolition? I thought about calling my sister back, getting more details, but what was the point? I'd heard enough. I'd heard everything I needed to know and more than I could bear. The specifics would only make it worse, would only add more images to the gallery of betrayal that was already setting up permanent residence in my skull. Instead, I lay back on the scratchy motel bedspread and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of some country I'd never visit. Outside, the neon sign continued its angry buzzing, casting pink and blue shadows across the walls like some demented aurora borealis. This was what rock bottom looked like, I realized. Not the dramatic crash I'd always imagined, not some spectacular explosion of emotion and confrontation. Just me, alone in a cheap motel room, listening to broken air conditioning and trying to figure out how to rebuild a life from the ashes of everything I'd thought was real. But here's what I didn't know yet. Sitting there in that room that smelled like disappointment and disinfectant, this wasn't rock bottom. This was just the beginning. Because while I was learning how to breathe around the knife in my chest, forces were already moving that would change everything. Legal documents were waiting in filing cabinets. Phone records were stored in databases. Flight manifests were logged in airline computers. And somewhere in all of that paperwork and data, justice was sleeping, waiting for someone angry enough and smart enough to wake it up. I was about to become that someone. The morning after the world ended. I woke up to sunlight streaming through curtains that looked like they'd been picked out during the Carter administration. The light was harsh, unforgiving, nothing like the gentle morning glow that used to filter through our bedroom windows, my bedroom windows. I corrected myself. Because apparently, I'd been living alone for years without knowing it. The motel room looked even worse in daylight. What had seemed merely shabby in the neon-tinged darkness now revealed itself to be genuinely squalid. Burn marks on the dresser, rust stains around the bathroom fixtures, carpet that felt sticky under my bare feet. This was where my new life had begun, in a place where people came to forget things, not to remember them. My phone had somehow turned itself back on during the night, or maybe I'd done it in my sleep, muscle memory overriding conscious decision. The screen showed 37 missed calls, 23 voicemails, and enough text messages to fill a small novel. All from him. All desperate, increasingly frantic attempts to reel me back in before I could think too clearly about what I'd learned. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. After 7 years of marriage, I knew his playbook by heart. First would come concern. Where are you? I'm worried sick. Then confusion. I don't understand why you left. Did I do something wrong? Then anger. This is ridiculous. Come home so we can talk like adults. And finally, manipulation. You're scaring me. This isn't like you. I love you. Love. The word felt foreign now, like something I'd learned in a language I was no longer fluent in. Had he ever loved me? Or had I just been convenient? A steady presence to come home to between adventures, a safe harbor between storms he created with other women in other cities? I was still staring at my phone when it started ringing. Not him this time, a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the hope that someone somewhere had answers to questions I didn't even know how to ask yet. Mrs. Morrison? This is David Castellanos from Castellanos, Kim and Associates. I've been trying to reach you. A lawyer. Of course. Because apparently, this nightmare wasn't complete without legal complications. I'm sorry, I don't understand. I haven't hired a lawyer. No, ma'am, you haven't. But I think you might want to, once you hear what I have to tell you. There was something in his voice, not quite excitement, but a kind of professional satisfaction that suggested he was about to deliver news that would be very good for me and very bad for someone else. I'm listening. It's regarding your husband's business holdings. Are you aware that several of his assets are titled in your name? I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. What? Tax purposes, most likely. It's not uncommon for married business owners to put property and investments in their spouse's name to minimize liability and reduce tax burden. The thing is, Mrs. Morrison, legally speaking, those assets belong to you. All of them. The room felt like it was spinning. How many assets are we talking about? Well, that's what I'd like to discuss with you in person. Are you available to come in today? I looked around the motel room. At the water-stained ceiling, the peeling wallpaper, the plastic chair that probably hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration. Then I thought about my husband, probably awake by now, probably panicking as he realized I wasn't coming home with my tail between my legs like I always did after our fights. Yes, I said. I'm available. 2 hours later, I was sitting in David Castellanos' office, a place that screamed success from every carefully chosen detail. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, mahogany furniture that probably cost more than my annual salary, degrees and awards covering one wall like trophies in a hunter's den. Castellanos himself was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of sharp suit and sharper smile that suggested he'd never met a legal loophole he couldn't exploit. He spread documents across his desk like a dealer laying out cards, and with each paper he revealed, my understanding of my situation shifted a little more. This is the deed to the warehouse property on Industrial Boulevard, he said, sliding one document toward me. Fair market value, approximately $2.3 million. My mouth went dry. I'm sorry, what? And this is the portfolio of investment properties in the downtown district. For buildings, total value around $6.8 million. Another document joined the first. I stared at the papers like they were written in hieroglyphics. There has to be some mistake. No mistake, Mrs. Morrison. Your husband has been very creative with his asset management. Everything of significant value is in your name. The business accounts, the real estate holdings, even the majority stake in his consulting firm. Castellanos leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. From a legal standpoint, you're not just his wife. You're his business partner. His majority business partner. The words hit me like a physical blow. All those years of feeling financially dependent, of having to ask for money for groceries while he traveled the world in business class with women in red dresses. All those times he'd made me feel like I contributed nothing to our life together, like I was just along for the ride. Turns out, I'd been driving the whole time. Why would he do this? I asked, though I was starting to understand. Why put everything in my name? Liability protection. If his business got sued, if he defaulted on loans, if he ran into legal trouble, none of it could touch these assets because they're not legally his. It's a common strategy among business owners who engage in, shall we say, high-risk behavior. High-risk behavior. Like sleeping with other women while married. Like living a double life that could explode at any moment. What does this mean exactly? I asked. Castellanos smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd just drawn a royal flush. It means, Mrs. Morrison, that your husband made a very expensive mistake when he decided to betray your trust. Because all of this, he gestured at the documents spread across his desk, legally belongs to you. All of it. I felt something shift inside my chest, something that had been clenched tight since last night finally beginning to loosen. Not relief, exactly. Something sharper than that. Something that tasted like possibility and justice and power I'd never known I had. What are my options? I asked. Well, that depends on what you want to accomplish. Are you looking for reconciliation? Revenge? Financial security? Because legally speaking, you hold all the cards here. I thought about my husband, probably frantically trying to reach me, probably planning the speech he'd give when I finally came home. The apologies, the explanations, the promises that it would never happen again. The way he'd make me feel guilty for leaving, for overreacting, for not giving him a chance to make things right. Then I thought about the woman in the red dress, holding his hand on a plane to Paris while I sat at home like a fool, trusting and waiting and believing in a life that was apparently just an elaborate performance piece. I want him to understand exactly what he's lost, I said. Castellanos's smile widened. I think we can arrange that. When I left his office 3 hours later, I had copies of every document, a detailed action plan, and a retainer agreement that would make David Castellanos a very wealthy man. But more than that, I had something I hadn't possessed since last night: power. For 7 years, I'd been living my life according to his schedule, his needs, his whims. Where we lived, how we spent money, when we went on vacation, who we socialized with, everything had been filtered through his preferences, his convenience, his approval. I'd been a supporting character in my own life, and I'd been grateful for the privilege. But sitting in that lawyer's office, surrounded by documents that proved my husband had been hiding the scope of his wealth while making me feel like a financial burden, something fundamental had changed. The woman who'd fled to a motel last night was gone. In her place was someone harder, smarter, angrier. Someone who knew exactly what she was worth. My phone had been buzzing constantly throughout the meeting, more calls, more texts, more desperate attempts to drag me back into the web of lies and manipulation that had been masquerading as my marriage. But I didn't feel the familiar guilt anymore, the automatic urge to rush home and smooth things over. Instead, I felt something I'd never experienced before: the cold, clean satisfaction of holding all the cards in a game where the other player didn't even know we were playing. I was about to teach my husband a lesson about the difference between control and power. He'd had control over the narrative, over the money, over my sense of reality. But power? Real power? That had been mine all along. I just hadn't known it yet. The sound of silence. I spent the next 3 days in that motel room, and they were the quietest 3 days of my adult life. Not peaceful quiet, the kind that comes from meditation or relaxation, but the profound, almost supernatural silence that happens when you stop participating in someone else's chaos. My phone had become a museum exhibit of desperation. By day 2, the calls were coming every 20 minutes. By day 3, the voicemails had evolved into audio dissertations, each one more creative than the last in its attempts to explain away the impossible. He'd found out about my sister's call somehow, probably called her himself when I wouldn't answer, and the explanations were masterpieces of creative fiction. It was a business trip. The woman was a client. My sister had been mistaken. It wasn't him at all, just someone who looked similar. The woman was actually married to his business partner. She was his cousin. She was having a medical emergency, and he was helping her get to Paris for treatment. Each voicemail was a work of art, really. I almost admired the creativity, the way he could spin elaborate narratives on demand. 7 years of marriage, and I'd never realized I was living with a world-class fantasist. But I didn't call back. I didn't text. I didn't engage with any of it. For the first time in our relationship, I had information he didn't know I had, and I was learning the intoxicating power of silence. Silence, I discovered, was terrifying to people who were used to controlling the narrative. Every hour I didn't respond was another hour he had to sit with his own guilt, another hour he had to wonder what I knew, what I was planning, whether his carefully constructed house of cards was about to come tumbling down. And it was about to come tumbling down. Oh, was it ever? By day 2, my sister had called me back. She'd done some investigating of her own. pulled flight records, talked to other crew members, even managed to get photos from the airline's security cameras. The evidence was comprehensive, damning, and absolutely irrefutable. This isn't his first trip with her, she told me, her voice tight with anger. Clara, I checked the passenger manifests going back 6 months. They've flown together at least 8 times. Always to different cities, always first class or business class, always under his name and hers. Her name was Amanda Hartwell. She was 34, divorced, worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company. She had blonde hair and blue eyes and a smile that looked expensive. In the photos my sister had managed to obtain, she was looking at my husband the way I used to look at him, like he was the most fascinating person in the world, like every word out of his mouth was a revelation. The poor, stupid woman had no idea she was auditioning for the role of second wife in a drama where I wasn't scheduled to exit until much later in the script. There's more, my sister continued. I talked to Jenny Prasad. You remember her, the flight attendant I went through training with? She's worked several of their flights. Clara, they're not just sleeping together. They're playing house. Ordering wine together, sharing meals, talking about weekend plans. She calls him baby. He calls her sweetheart. Sweetheart. The same endearment he'd used with me the night my world collapsed. How economical of him. Why learn new words when the old ones worked so well? How long do you think this has been going on? I asked. Based on the flight records? At least 8 months. But Clara. I think there might have been others before her. Of course there had been. This wasn't a moment of weakness, or a midlife crisis, or any of the other convenient explanations that cheating husbands and their enablers liked to use. This was a pattern. A lifestyle. A carefully orchestrated system of lies that had been running parallel to our marriage for who knows how long. I thought about all the times I'd felt guilty for not being enough. Not interesting enough, not successful enough, not exciting enough to keep him happy. All the times I'd wondered if I was boring him, if he was settling for me, if he stayed with me out of pity or habit rather than love. Turns out, he hadn't been settling at all. He'd been having his cake and eating it too, maintaining the stable home base of our marriage while conducting a series of romantic adventures that would have made Casanova proud. And I'd been the perfect patsy, trusting, undemanding, never asking too many questions about his business trips or working late nights. God, I'd been so fucking naive. But naivety was a luxury I could no longer afford. Because while I was sitting in that motel room, processing the scope of his betrayal, David Castellanos was working his legal magic. Asset valuations were being conducted. Financial records were being subpoenaed. The fortress of lies my husband had built was being systematically dismantled by people who did this for a living. On day 3, I finally decided to venture out. Not home, never home, not yet, but into the world I was going to have to navigate as a single woman with considerably more money than I'd thought possible. I needed clothes that weren't 3 days old. I needed food that didn't come from vending machines. I needed to start behaving like someone who had options instead of someone who was hiding. The first thing I did was go shopping. Not the careful, budget-conscious shopping I'd been doing for years, checking prices, comparing options, making sure every purchase was justifiable. This was different. This was shopping like someone who owned multiple investment properties and a majority stake in a consulting firm. I bought a dress that cost more than I used to spend on clothes in 6 months. Black, perfectly tailored, the kind of dress that whispered rather than shouted, but somehow commanded attention anyway. I bought shoes that made me 3 inches taller and 10 times more confident. I bought a handbag that was, according to the sales associate, an investment piece. Everything was an investment now. Every choice, every purchase, every decision was about building the person I was going to become now that I knew who I really was. While I was getting my hair done, styled, not just cut, by someone who charged more per hour than I used to make in a day, my phone rang. Not my husband this time. A number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Morrison? This is Patricia Wells from the Mitchell Group. We're a public relations firm. I understand you might be in need of our services. Public relations. I hadn't thought about that aspect of what was coming. When this all went public, and it was going public, because secrets this big don't stay buried, there would be stories. Articles. People taking sides and choosing narratives. I'm not sure I understand, I said. Mrs. Morrison, your husband is a fairly prominent businessman in this city. When news breaks about his extracurricular activities, there's going to be media attention. We want to make sure your side of the story gets told properly. My side of the story. I'd been so focused on the legal and financial aspects of my situation that I hadn't considered the social implications. But Patricia Wells was right, this was going to be news. Prominent local businessman caught cheating with multiple women while wife discovers she actually owns his empire? That was front-page material. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. Image management. Narrative control. Making sure that when people hear this story, they see you as the strong, dignified woman who took control of her situation, not as the victim who got left behind. Victim. The word made something sharp and hot flare in my chest. I wasn't a victim. I was a woman who'd been lied to, but I was also a woman who was about to become very, very wealthy as a direct result of those lies. That wasn't victimhood, that was justice. Send me your information, I said. I'll be in touch. When I finally returned to the motel that evening, my last night there, I'd decided I looked different. Not just the clothes and the hair, though those helped. Something in my posture had changed, something in the way I carried myself. I walked into that shabby room like I owned it, because I was finally beginning to understand that I owned a lot more than I'd ever imagined. My phone showed 43 missed calls from my husband. I deleted them all without listening. Then I called David Castellanos. I'm ready to move forward, I told him. Excellent. What's the first step you'd like to take? I looked around the motel room one last time, at the water-stained ceiling, the peeling wallpaper, the neon light that had kept me awake for 3 nights. This was where my old life had ended. Tomorrow, my new life would begin. I want to call a meeting, I said. His family, his business partners, anyone who thinks they have a say in what happens next. I want them all in one room. And then, I smiled, and it felt like the first genuine smile I'd worn in years. Then I'm going to teach them the difference between what they thought they knew and what they're about to learn. The dinner invitation. The call came on Thursday morning. My mother-in-law, Eleanor Morrison, with her perfectly modulated voice and her talent for making requests sound like royal decrees. Clara, darling, I think it's time we all sat down and talked through this misunderstanding like civilized adults. Misunderstanding. As if my husband being caught red-handed with another woman was just a simple miscommunication, a clerical error that could be resolved with proper etiquette and enough denial. I don't think there's anything to misunderstand, Eleanor. Nonsense. David is beside himself with worry. You've been gone for 4 days without a word, and frankly, your behavior is becoming quite concerning. This isn't like you at all. She was right about that, at least. The old Clara would have come crawling back by now, full of apologies for overreacting, ready to work things out like a good little wife. The old Clara would have accepted whatever explanation they offered and pretended to believe it because the alternative, facing the truth, was too frightening to contemplate. But the old Clara had died in a motel room 3 nights ago. The woman talking to Eleanor Morrison was someone entirely different. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. Dinner. Saturday night. The whole family will be there, David's brother Michael and his wife, his sister Jennifer, myself and Richard, of course. And David is hoping you'll come home so you can both work through whatever this is together. Home. The word felt strange, almost foreign. The house I'd been living in for 7 years suddenly seemed like a movie set, a carefully constructed backdrop for a life that had never been real. How could I go home to a place that had been built on lies? But then I thought about what David Castellanos had told me during our last meeting. About power dynamics and psychological warfare and the importance of controlling the narrative. About how sometimes the best way to win a game was to let your opponents think they were winning right up until the moment you revealed your hand. Where? I asked. Chez Laurent. 8 o'clock. I've already made the reservation. Of course she had. Chez Laurent, the most expensive restaurant in the city, the kind of place where entrees started at $60 and the wine list read like a small novel. The kind of place where the Morrison family conducted all their important business, where they could control the environment and minimize the chances of public scenes. They thought they were inviting me to my own surrender. They had no idea they were arranging their own execution. I'll be there, I said. Wonderful. And Clara? Do try to wear something appropriate. You know how important appearances are. Appearances. Right. Because the most important thing about your son's infidelity was making sure his wife looked presentable while she was being manipulated into forgetting about it. After I hung up, I sat in my new apartment. Yes, I'd finally moved out of the motel and into a furnished place downtown, somewhere with actual heat and walls that didn't leak despair, and thought about what this dinner really represented. It wasn't an olive branch. It was an intervention. They were going to surround me with family pressure and social expectations, use every weapon in their considerable arsenal to bring me back into line. Guilt about abandoning my husband. Shame about my overreaction. Promises that whatever had happened would never happen again. Appeals to my sense of duty, my commitment to the family, my role as a Morrison wife. They were going to try to make me complicit in my own continued betrayal, and they were going to make it seem like the civilized, mature thing to do. The funny thing was, part of me was actually looking forward to it. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharp and clear. I spent 2 hours getting ready, treating it like armor preparation before a battle. The black dress I'd bought earlier in the week, the one that whispered rather than shouted. Jewelry that was understated but unmistakably expensive, pieces I'd inherited from my grandmother and never worn because my husband preferred me to look approachable. Heels that added 3 inches to my height and 10 years to my confidence. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I barely recognized. Not because of the clothes or the makeup, but because of something in my eyes. Something hard and certain and completely unafraid. The old Clara would have been nervous about this dinner, worried about saying the wrong thing or making the situation worse. The new Clara was going to this dinner like a general approaching a battlefield where she already knew the outcome. Chez Laurent was exactly what I'd expected: white tablecloths, crystal chandeliers, waiters who moved like dancers, and spoke in whispers. The Morrison family table was in the back corner, the kind of semi-private spot where important conversations could happen without fear of eavesdropping. They were all there when I arrived. Eleanor, regal in navy blue, with her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her disapproving expression already in place. Richard, my father-in-law, looking uncomfortable in his expensive suit, the way he always did when forced to deal with emotions. Michael and his wife Karen, both radiating the kind of forced cheer that suggested they'd been briefed on their roles in tonight's performance. Jennifer, my sister-in-law, avoiding eye contact because she'd never liked me anyway, and now she had an excuse. And my husband, David, sitting at the head of the table like the prodigal son, looking appropriately contrite but not quite broken enough for my taste. He'd lost weight in the past week, I noticed. Good. Maybe guilt burned calories. Clara. He stood when he saw me, the way he'd been taught to do by his mother when ladies approached the table. Such a gentleman. Such impeccable manners. Too bad they didn't extend his marriage vows. David. I didn't smile. I didn't reach for him when he moved as if to embrace me. I simply stood there, looking at him with the kind of cool assessment usually reserved for strangers. Because that's what he was now. A stranger who happened to share my last name and my legal address. You look beautiful, he said, and his voice carried just the right note of tentative hope, as if my appearance was a sign that I was ready to forgive and forget. Thank you. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable before Eleanor stepped in, the social conductor orchestrating the evening's performance. Please sit down, dear. We're so glad you could join us. I took my seat, not next to my husband, but across from him, where I could watch his face throughout the meal. Where I could see every micro-expression, every tell, every moment when his mask slipped. The first course arrived with the kind of theatrical presentation that only restaurants like Chez Laurent could manage. Tiny portions of food that looked like art installations, accompanied by wine that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a month. So, Eleanor began, cutting into her appetizer with surgical precision. I think we all know why we're here. David has explained the situation, and while we're all disappointed in how things have developed, we're family. Families work through difficulties together. Disappointed. Such a wonderfully understated word for discovering that your son and brother had been living a double life for months, possibly years. Has he explained the situation? I asked, taking a sip of wine that tasted like money and regret, because I'd love to hear his version. David shifted in his seat, clearly not expecting me to go on the offensive so quickly. Clara, I know you're angry. Angry. I repeated the word like I was testing its flavor. That's an interesting choice. Is that what you'd call it if you discovered I'd been flying around the country with other men for months? The table went silent. Even the ambient noise from the rest of the restaurant seemed to fade, as if the entire room was holding its breath. It's not what you think, David said, and I had to admire his commitment to the script. Even now, even caught red-handed, he was still trying to gaslight me into questioning my own reality. What I think, I said, setting down my wine glass with deliberate care, is that my sister, who works for the airline, watched you board a flight to Paris with a woman named Amanda Hartwell. What I think is that you've been traveling with various women for months while I sat at home like a fool, planning our future and budgeting our expenses and never questioning why you needed so many business trips. Eleanor's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Richard was staring at his plate like it contained the answers to life's mysteries. Michael and Karen were exchanging the kind of look that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. There are explanations, David said. Business reasons. Things you don't understand about my work. Things I don't understand. I smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made everyone at the table uncomfortable. David, there are clearly many things I don't understand. For instance, I don't understand why someone who makes his wife feel guilty about buying groceries owns 6 investment properties worth nearly $9 million. The silence that followed was so complete it had weight. I could hear my heart beating, could hear the soft whisper of the air conditioning, could practically hear the collective intake of breath from 6 people who had just realized that their carefully planned intervention had become something else entirely. I don't understand, I continued, why someone who controls every penny of our household budget would put all of his major assets in his wife's name. I don't understand why someone who claims to respect marriage would risk everything for a series of weekend getaways with women who think they're in relationships with a single man. David's face had gone white. Not pale, white, like someone had literally drained the blood from his cheeks. Clara, how did I find out that I'm not your dependent, David? That I'm actually your business partner? Your majority business partner, according to the documents my lawyer showed me yesterday. Eleanor set down her fork with a sharp clink against the china. Your lawyer. David Castellanos. Lovely man. Very thorough. He's been helping me understand exactly what my legal position is in all this. I took another sip of wine, savoring both the taste and the look of dawning horror on my husband's face. Turns out, when you put assets in someone else's name to avoid tax liability, those assets actually belong to that person. Legally speaking. This is ridiculous, Jennifer finally spoke up, her voice sharp with the kind of indignation that comes from watching your family's carefully maintained facade crumble in real time. You can't seriously be considering. Considering what? I turned to look at her, and she actually flinched. Considering protecting my own interests? Considering that my husband has been committing adultery while I unknowingly financed his affairs? Considering that maybe, just maybe, I deserve better than being lied to, cheated on, and then lectured about family loyalty. The waiter appeared as if by magic, clearly sensing the tension but professionally obligated to ignore it. "How is everything this evening?" "Perfect," I said, not taking my eyes off my husband's face. "Absolutely perfect." After the waiter retreated, Eleanor tried to regain control of the conversation. "Clara, I understand you're upset, but surely we can work this out like adults. David made a mistake." "A mistake." I laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. "Eleanor, mistakes are forgetting to pick up milk or miscalculating a tip. What your son did was conduct a systematic campaign of lies and betrayal while using my legal name to hide assets that I was never supposed to know about. The assets were always meant to be shared," David said desperately. "It was for tax purposes, for protection." "I was going to tell you." "When?" The word came out like a whip crack. "When were you going to tell me, David?" "Before or after you married Amanda Hartwell. Because according to the photos my sister obtained, you two look pretty serious." The second course arrived, but no one was eating anymore. 6 plates of expensive food sat untouched while a marriage and a family imploded in real time. "I want you to understand something," I said, standing up from the table. "All of you. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about anger. This is about consequences. For 7 years, I lived in a fantasy. I thought I was married to a man who loved me, respected me, saw me as an equal partner in our life together. I thought I was part of a family that valued honesty and commitment. I looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. But I wasn't married to the man I thought I was. I was married to a stranger who used me as a cover story while he lived the life he actually wanted with other women. And you, all of you, you were willing to help him maintain that lie. You were willing to make me complicit in my own betrayal." I picked up my purse, a deliberate, final gesture. "But here's what you need to understand now. The woman who would have accepted that, who would have swallowed her pain and pretended everything was fine for the sake of keeping the family together, she doesn't exist anymore." I started to walk away, then stopped and turned back. "Oh, and David? You might want to call your lawyer. Because mine will be in touch on Monday morning." I walked out of Chez Laurent with my head high and my spine straight, leaving behind 6 people who were finally beginning to understand that they had catastrophically misread the situation. Behind me, I could hear the beginning of what would undoubtedly be a very interesting family discussion. But that was their problem now. I had bigger things to worry about, like deciding what to do with an empire I'd never known I owned. The Reckoning. The first article appeared online Tuesday morning. "Local businessman's marriage implodes over international affair," read the headline, and the accompanying photo was one I recognized from my husband's LinkedIn profile, all confident smile and expensive suit, projecting the image of a successful man who had his life perfectly under control. If only they could see him now. I was sitting in my new apartment, drinking coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of the bitter sludge I'd been choking down for a week, when my phone started buzzing with notifications. Social media mentions, news alerts, text messages from numbers I didn't recognize. The story was spreading like wildfire, and it was spreading exactly the way Patricia Wells had predicted it would. The narrative was perfect. Successful businessman betrays devoted wife. Wife discovers she actually owns his empire. Wife takes control and kicks him to the curb. It was a story tailor-made for the social media age: justice, betrayal, female empowerment, and financial comeuppance, all wrapped up in a package that practically begged to be shared. By Wednesday, the local news stations had picked it up. By Thursday, it had gone national. By Friday, my husband's business was in free fall. David Castellanos called me every few hours with updates, each one more satisfying than the last. Morrison Consulting lost the Henderson account, he reported on Tuesday afternoon. Apparently, they don't want to be associated with the negative publicity. 3 more clients canceled their contracts yesterday, he told me Wednesday morning. Word is getting around that the business is in chaos. The building management company called, came Thursday's update. They want to discuss the lease on his office space. Seems they're concerned about his ability to make payments. Each phone call was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. The empire my husband had built through careful networking and strategic manipulation was crumbling as the people who'd once respected him realized they'd been dealing with a fraud. But the professional consequences were nothing compared to the social devastation. Eleanor Morrison, who'd spent 30 years building her reputation as the perfect society matron, was suddenly finding herself uninvited from charity galas and garden parties. The whispers followed her everywhere. How could she not have known? How could she have raised a son capable of such betrayal? How could she have tried to cover it up? Michael and Karen were getting similar treatment. Their country club was buzzing with gossip about the Morrison family drama, and Karen was discovering that being related to an unfaithful husband made you guilty by association in certain social circles. Even Jennifer, who'd barely hidden her dislike of me throughout the marriage, was feeling the backlash. Her husband's law firm was distancing itself from any association with the Morrison family, and she was learning the hard way that scandal doesn't discriminate when it comes to collateral damage. But the person suffering the most was, of course, my dear husband. David had always prided himself on his reputation. He was the guy other men wanted to be: successful, charming, with a beautiful wife and a perfect life. He gave speeches at business conferences about leadership and integrity. He served on the boards of charitable organizations. He was the kind of man mothers pointed to when they wanted to tell their daughters what to look for in a husband. Now he was a cautionary tale. The Amanda Hartwell story had come out in detail, thanks to my sister's thorough investigation and Patricia Wells's strategic media management. Flight records, hotel receipts, photographs, even text messages that Amanda herself had provided once she realized she'd been lied to as thoroughly as I had. Turns out, my husband had told Amanda that we were separated, that he was in the process of getting divorced, but couldn't make it public yet due to business complications. She'd thought she was dating a soon-to-be divorced businessman, not conducting an affair with a married man who was using his wife's name to hide assets. When the truth came out, Amanda had been almost as devastated as I was. Almost. The difference was that she'd only wasted 8 months on him. I'd wasted 7 years. But Amanda's reaction had been swift and decisive. She'd provided evidence, cooperated with journalists, and made it very clear that she'd been as much a victim of David's lies as anyone else. The story painted her as another woman deceived by a master manipulator, not as a home-wrecking other woman, which left David completely alone to face the consequences of his choices. I should have felt sorry for him. On some level, I probably did. Watching someone's entire life implode, even someone who deserved it, wasn't exactly pleasant. But every time I started to feel sympathy, I remembered sitting in our living room that night, watching him sip his coffee and smile at me while he knew that I'd just discovered his betrayal. He'd been prepared to let me live in that agony, prepared to let me question my own sanity and doubt my own perceptions, rather than simply admit what he'd done. He'd been prepared to lie to my face for as long as it took to contain the damage to his reputation. That wasn't a moment of weakness or a mistake in judgment. That was cruelty. The business calls started on Friday. David's partners, his investors, his clients, all of them suddenly very interested in speaking with me about the future of Morrison Consulting and its various holdings. Mrs. Morrison, I'm calling about the downtown development project. Given the circumstances, we wanted to clarify who we should be dealing with moving forward. Mrs. Morrison, this is James Fletcher from Fletcher and Associates. We've been reviewing the contracts for the warehouse properties, and we need to discuss some payment issues. Mrs. Morrison, I hope you don't mind me calling directly, but we're concerned about the stability of Morrison Consulting given the recent developments. Each call was a reminder that I wasn't just David's estranged wife anymore. I was a business owner, a property holder, a woman with genuine economic power. These people weren't calling me out of courtesy or sympathy. They were calling because I controlled assets they needed to work with. It was intoxicating. For 7 years, I'd been Mrs. David Morrison, a title that meant I was someone's wife and not much else. Now I was Clara Morrison, majority owner of Morrison Consulting, holder of multiple property deeds, controller of investment accounts worth more money than I'd ever imagined having. The irony was delicious. In trying to protect his assets from potential legal trouble, David had accidentally given me everything he'd worked to build. In trying to maintain control over our finances while living his double life, he'd handed me complete control over his future. By the end of the week, I had a decision to make. David Castellanos had laid out my options with his usual precision. I could liquidate everything, sell the properties, close the business, take the money, and start over somewhere else. I could maintain the status quo, keep the assets, but let David continue running the business, essentially becoming his boss rather than his wife. Or I could take active control, hire new management, rebrand the company, turn David's empire into my own. What would you recommend? I asked during our Friday afternoon meeting. That depends on what you want to accomplish, he said. Are you looking for maximum financial return? Complete separation from your husband? Public vindication? Revenge. Revenge. The word hung in the air between us like smoke from an expensive cigar. What would revenge look like? I asked. David Castellanos smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd been hoping I'd ask that question. Revenge would look like keeping everything. The business, the properties, the investments, all of it. Hire new management, rebrand the company, and let your husband watch while you build something better from the ashes of what he destroyed. I thought about that. About David sitting in whatever cheap apartment he could afford now, watching the business he'd spent 15 years building become mine. About him having to explain to potential employers why his last job had ended with his wife taking over his company. About him having to live with the knowledge that his own greed and deception had cost him everything he'd cared about. And legally, I can do that? Legally, you can do whatever you want. The assets are yours, free and clear. He has no recourse, no claim, no power to stop you. I looked out the window of Castellanos' office, down at the city where I'd lived for 7 years as someone's wife and where I was about to start living as myself. Do it, I said. Monday morning's headlines read, "Betrayed wife takes control of husband's business empire." By Monday afternoon, the newly rechristened Morrison Holdings had new management, new policies, and a new mission statement that made no mention of the previous owner. David Morrison, once the prince of his own kingdom, was now just another unemployed, middle-aged man with a scandal in his past and no references for his resume. And I was the woman who'd gone from victim to victor in less than 2 weeks. The transformation was so complete, so total, that sometimes I had to remind myself it was real. That the woman sitting in the executive office of a multi-million-dollar company was the same woman who'd fled to a motel a month ago, broken and betrayed and believing she had no options. But then I'd look at the papers on my desk, property deeds and business contracts and investment portfolios all bearing my name, and I'd remember that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes the best revenge is winning so completely that your enemies disappear into irrelevance while you build something magnificent from the wreckage of their lies. The final judgment. 3 months after the night my world split in two, I sat in a courtroom listening to a judge decide what was left of my marriage. The proceedings were a formality at this point. David had no grounds to contest the divorce, no assets to fight over, no power to negotiate from. He was asking for alimony. The audacity was breathtaking. The man who'd hidden millions of dollars in assets while making me feel guilty about grocery expenses was now claiming financial hardship and requesting spousal support. The man who'd spent months flying around the world with other women while I planned our future was now arguing that he deserved compensation for the dissolution of our marriage. His lawyer, a public defender, since David could no longer afford private representation, made the case with as much dignity as possible under the circumstances. Economic interdependence, they called it. Mutual support obligations. The standard arguments that applied when marriages ended due to irreconcilable differences rather than systematic betrayal and financial fraud. My lawyer, David Castellanos, listened to their presentation with the kind of polite attention you might give to a child explaining why the sky was purple. When his turn came, he was surgical in his precision. Your Honor, Mr. Morrison is requesting financial support from the woman whose identity he used to commit what amounts to financial fraud. Every asset he claims to have built was legally owned by Mrs. Morrison. Every business decision he made was made with her authority, whether she knew it or not. He spent 7 years living off her legal ownership of property worth nearly $10 million while conducting multiple extramarital affairs that he funded with money that was, legally speaking, hers. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and no patience for nonsense, listened without expression. When both sides had finished their presentations, she took off her glasses and looked directly at my husband. Mr. Morrison, I've reviewed the financial records in this case extensively. Your request for spousal support is not only denied, it's borderline frivolous. You transferred assets to your wife's name to avoid tax liability and potential legal judgments. The fact that this strategy backfired when she discovered your infidelity doesn't entitle you to compensation. David's face crumpled. Actually crumpled, like paper being crushed in someone's fist. For 7 years, he'd been the one in control, the one making decisions, the one holding all the cards. Now he was discovering what it felt like to be powerless. Furthermore, the judge continued, Mrs. Morrison's decision to take control of assets that were legally hers is not vindictive or excessive. It's her right as the documented owner of those properties and investments. She signed the papers with firm, decisive strokes. Divorce granted. No spousal support. No division of assets, as there are no marital assets to divide. Everything of value is already in Mrs. Morrison's name. And just like that, it was over. 7 years of marriage dissolved in less than 30 minutes of legal proceedings. No drama, no fighting, no last-minute appeals. Just the simple, brutal efficiency of a system that recognized legal ownership and had no interest in emotional arguments about fairness or intentions. I walked out of that courtroom a free woman, free from lies, free from manipulation, free from a man who'd seen me as a convenient placeholder in a life I was never supposed to fully understand. David tried to approach me in the hallway outside the courtroom. His lawyer had already disappeared, probably eager to distance himself from such a hopeless case. David looked older, somehow diminished. The confidence that had once made him so attractive was gone, replaced by something desperate and small. Clara, please. Can we just talk for a minute? I stopped and looked at him. Really looked at him, maybe for the first time since that night when my sister called. He was still handsome in that conventional way that had first caught my attention years ago. Still well-dressed, though his suit wasn't quite as expensive as the ones he used to wear. Still capable of that pleading expression that had gotten him out of trouble so many times before. But I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no lingering affection. Just a kind of mild curiosity, the way you might look at a stranger on the street who reminded you of someone you used to know. What would you like to talk about? I asked. I know I made mistakes. Mistakes. I repeated the word thoughtfully. Is that what we're calling them? I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But Clara, we had 7 good years together. That has to count for something. The way things ended, it doesn't erase everything we built. Everything we built. I almost laughed. We hadn't built anything together. I'd been living in a house of lies while he built a secret empire using my name and a secret life using other women's hearts. David, I said, and my voice was gentle, almost kind. You're right that we had 7 years together. But here's what you need to understand. Those 7 years meant something completely different to each of us. You spent them constructing an elaborate fiction. I spent them believing in it. He opened his mouth to argue, but I held up a hand. I'm not angry anymore, I continued. Anger requires caring, and I don't care about you enough to be angry. You're just a stranger who used to live in my house. A stranger who happened to accidentally give me the best gift of my life. Gift. You gave me myself back, David. For 7 years, I was Mrs. David Morrison, a supporting character in your story, a convenient wife who never asked too many questions. Now I'm just Clara Morrison, owner of Morrison Holdings, and I'm discovering that I like her much better than the woman I used to be. I turned to leave, then stopped one more time. Oh, and David? Amanda Hartwell called me last week. She wanted to apologize, to make sure there were no hard feelings. We're having lunch next Tuesday. Turns out, we have a lot in common. His face went white. The idea that his victims might become allies, that we might compare notes and share stories, clearly hadn't occurred to him. I left him standing in that courthouse hallway, probably trying to figure out how his life had become something he no longer recognized. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I had a business to run, properties to manage, a life to build from the ground up. 6 months later, I'm writing this from my new office on the top floor of a building I now own in the heart of downtown. The view from my windows stretches across the entire city, and on clear days like today, I can see all the way to the horizon. It's a view that says anything is possible, that the world is vast and full of opportunities for people brave enough to seize them. Morrison Holdings is thriving. We've expanded into new markets, hired additional staff, and developed innovative strategies that have made us one of the most successful consulting firms in the region. The business that David spent 15 years building has become something better under my leadership. More ethical, more sustainable, more profitable. The irony isn't lost on me that his betrayal made all of this possible. If he'd been faithful, if he'd been honest about our finances, if he'd treated me as a true partner instead of a convenient accessory, I might have spent the rest of my life as Mrs. David Morrison, never knowing what I was capable of achieving on my own. Instead, his lies freed me to discover who I really was. The woman I've become is someone I actually like. She's confident without being arrogant, successful without being ruthless, powerful without being cruel. She makes decisions based on her own values rather than someone else's expectations. She doesn't apologize for taking up space or having opinions or demanding respect. Most importantly, she doesn't need anyone else to validate her worth. I still get updates about David occasionally, though I don't seek them out. He's working for a small consulting firm in another city, making a fraction of what he used to earn. He's dating someone new, a woman in her 20s who probably thinks she's landed herself a sophisticated older man with business experience. I almost feel sorry for her. Almost. Eleanor Morrison sends Christmas cards, as if we're all still one big happy family. I don't respond, but I don't throw them away either. They serve as useful reminders of who I used to be and who I never want to be again. Amanda Hartwell and I did have that lunch, and several more since then. She's become something of a friend, actually. There's a strange bond between women who've been deceived by the same man, an understanding that goes deeper than conventional friendship. We don't talk about David much, he's ancient history for both of us, but we've discovered we have similar business interests and complementary skills. She's actually joining Morrison Holdings next month as our new marketing director. The press release about her hiring will probably generate some attention, but not the kind that worries me anymore. I've learned that being talked about isn't the same as being talked down to, and that people who matter don't judge you for refusing to be a victim. Sometimes I think about that night when my sister called, when my world split in two, and I learned that nothing I'd believed about my life was true. It was the worst night of my life and the best thing that ever happened to me, all at the same time. The truth is, I should probably thank David for his betrayal. Not because I'm grateful for the pain he caused, that would be giving him too much credit, but because his cruelty accidentally set me free from a life that was too small for who I was meant to become. They once told me I'd be nothing without him. His mother, with her pointed comments about my career prospects and my dependence on her son. His sister, with her barely concealed contempt for the woman she saw as beneath their family standards. Even David himself, with his subtle undermining of my confidence and his careful management of our finances. They were wrong about everything except the fundamental premise. I am nothing like the woman I was when I was with him. That woman was afraid of conflict, afraid of independence, afraid of her own power. That woman made herself smaller so others could feel bigger. This woman doesn't make herself smaller for anyone. This woman owns buildings and runs businesses and makes decisions that affect dozens of employees and thousands of clients. This woman travels first class on her own credit cards to meetings with investors who compete for her attention. This woman looks in the mirror and sees someone worthy of respect, someone capable of great things, someone who will never again pretend to be less than she is for the comfort of others. The man in my living room that night, sitting in his expensive chair with his coffee and his lies, thought he knew who I was. The man on the plane to Paris, holding another woman's hand while I sat at home believing in our future, thought he could control the narrative of our lives indefinitely. Both versions of my husband were wrong. They called me a stranger when I stopped playing the role they'd written for me. But I'm not a stranger anymore. I'm exactly who I was always meant to be. I'm Clara Morrison, and I built this empire from the ashes of a life that was never really mine to begin with. I'm the woman who turned betrayal into victory, who transformed lies into liberation, who proved that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's becoming someone so magnificent that your enemies fade into irrelevance while you soar. And if you've ever been where I was that night, broken, betrayed, believing you have no options, know this. You have more power than you realize. You have more strength than they want you to know. You have more worth than they'll ever acknowledge. The life they told you that you couldn't have without them, you can have it without them. You can have something better. You just have to be brave enough to take it. The morning I walked out of that motel room and into my new life, I thought I was starting over from nothing. I didn't know I was starting over from everything. I didn't know I was finally coming home to myself. But now I do. And now, so do you.